Okay, so we've talked a lot about the Republicans tonight. Still want to touch up on the Democrats a little bit. Nathan has mentioned the two main candidates, essentially for the Democratic nomination, Jasmine Crockett, and the state, I believe, state House member running against Crockett. We're seeing Dems maybe trying to position him as the next Beto O'Rourke. Seems to be a young guy, seems to be maybe hip with the new generation, something like that.
Well, I don't know. I don't know how many of the new generation are watching Colbert, which I suppose it's now the Late Show rather than the Colbert Report. But interestingly, he was also on the Joe Rogan Show in 2025, and this was before he announced his candidacy. But kind of speaks to the fact that he's been building or trying to build this brand that reaches younger people, also through a TikTok channel that has gotten significant attention. And I would say with social media generally, but in particular TikTok, I always kind of look askance at like how much how much of what we're seeing is organic and how much could it be big money in some way or other factors promoting a particular candidate. But that being said, there's a lot of energy behind him. I can say, having spoken to early voters in Austin, which again is like the Talarico heartland, I heard a lot of Democrats saying, well, I like Crockett, would be great to have her as senator. I don't think Texas is ready to elect her. I think Talarico stands a better chance of actually getting the nomination and then actually being able to win in the general election. Crockett is someone who, I think having established this brand for herself, being sort of a Democratic firebrand and in sort of a parallel vein to MTG when she was in Congress, famously having some exchanges there. She is someone who has not been afraid to strike back at Talarico, and one could argue that the first serious attack came from Colin Allred releasing a video on Twitter where he accused Talarico, based on a conversation that apparently Crockett had with Talarico, of describing him as a mediocre black man, which then sort of set the tone for this contestation. The Talarico campaign has denied that, said it was a mischaracterization of a private conversation. Meanwhile, we've seen Big PAC behind Talarico, and I should note Talarico has said he wants to get big money out of politics, wants to get things like PACs out of politics, but he's the one in this contest who has the big money. A PAC associated with him producing its own attack ad against Jasmine Crockett, something she raised issues with. Again, really, we've mentioned some of the sparring between the Republicans. There's been a lot of that with the Democrats as well, and I would not underestimate that as a factor when it comes to the both primary and then once we come to the general election. It's possible that some Democrats, some core elements of the base might feel somehow demoralized or less enthusiastic. I think especially if Talarico is the nominee, maybe black voter turnout would not be what some Democrats hope, despite the expectation of the midterms being something of a strong showing for Democrats. I'll mention that in general, though, when we speak about these midterm signals, the early voting data I've seen, we have witnessed very strong turnout from Democrats in early voting. Republicans have not been turning out in nearly the same numbers for their contest. So some of that might just be for different behavior of these different blocks of voters. But I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of Republican strategists are looking at that and worrying as to what it could mean for the future, especially on the heels of races like the big Virginia elections last year and some other pre-midterm elections that have come across in many cases as relatively strong performances from the Democrats.
I think you made two great points there. I saw that today that the voting numbers is at a high, or like that it's kind of GOP strategists as well. And I think Crockett, I remember maybe around this time last year, maybe a couple months, maybe more like 9 months ago. Remember she at least tried her maybe media breakout moment. I remember she had the derogatory comment against Governor Abbott, what he was a Governor Hot Wheels or something, alluding to his disability. He's in a wheelchair. So I think she tried maybe that media breakout moment, but I don't think it really worked out for her as maybe she was trying to hope.
No. I mean, it's interesting because you have willingness to be rather vicious when it comes to rhetoric, and maybe there's an attempt there to reproduce okay, this is what it takes to get attention in 2025 or 2026. Again, sort of a parallel to some of the firebrands that we've seen on the right, which is interesting. It's going to be interesting to see what that translates to or does not translate to in this primary. She does, I should mention, have the backing of the Congressional Black Caucus. You certainly have not seen Jasmine Crockett, despite the fact that she doesn't have the organization that Talarico does. And I should mention that in Austin, I saw a lot of his volunteers, big, showing of what you might call grassroots support there. But despite that, I think it would be unwise to underestimate the extent to which she does have her fans, maybe older voters, maybe a certain percentage of progressive voters. One of the big things people will be looking at is, okay, how are Latino voters in Texas going to break this time? Are we going to see, for example, some people who voted for Trump in the last election, are they going to be in the Democratic primary? Or would those people continue voting for the Republicans? Would they, if they are just not interested in politics, would they just not turn out at all? A lot to keep track of. And in general, I think the expectation, as you note, this suburban turnout for Talarico in particular could be pretty crucial. And we're looking at not just Republican fragmentation here with the sort of high-profile Cornyn versus Paxton, then with Hunt in the mix sparring. But we're definitely seeing what could be signs of fragmentation or disunity among Democrats at a time when I think they really do not want to see that. They're really hoping to present the most unified front that they can. And Talarico has been running his campaign not as aggressively against President Trump as perhaps Crockett or some other candidates would be. He's someone who has tried to make the case that he is Christian. He's appealing to Christians in a state that is pretty religious. I should say, when I spoke to more Republican-leaning voters, early voters in Texas, didn't seem to be making much of an impact on them. I'm not sure how much that's going to matter, really, but sort of speaks to what we're seeing, I think, an attempt to reproduce that Beto O'Rourke phenomenon, but with a bit of a twist. The fact that this guy is a Presbyterian seminarian.
Politics is just like that. But this is, why does this race actually matter? Why are we having this episode? Why is this conversation worth having? Is that even just 5.5 years ago, coming up on 6 years, you have the Texas Senate election with Cruz and O'Rourke get razor thin almost for a Texas race. And it's also, I kind of alluded to this, you have the three main candidates all kind of having a different vision maybe for the future of conservative politics in the United States. Maybe how all three of them are going to play the border and other maybe red meat issues for the GOP voters. And as well, Nathan has alluded to it, just the sheer amount of money that is being spent in this campaign.
Absolutely. Yes. I think that, the contrast is a little less stark between Hunt and Paxton. And again, I'll be looking out to see where Paxton goes, where Hunt goes once it turns into a runoff. We even saw sort of a proxy battle in the State of the Union address. I was there in the House and watched both Cornyn arrive and also Attorney General Paxton, who was a guest of Troy Niels, who's more of a conservative in the House, but also someone who has been a very strong surrogate for President Trump, someone who is himself, I believe, not running for re-election, but his twin brother is going to be standing for that seat. So you mentioned this earlier, but when it comes to some of the things that Governor Abbott has done, declaring emergencies related to the border, contesting some of the policies under the Biden administration, there, I think it's fair to say, just more open border. The fact that they were creating this conflict between the state of Texas and the federal government, and Governor Abbott and Ken Paxton came out on one side of that. That's an area where I think Paxton has sought to draw a contrast. Again, to get into some of the material that the Paxton campaign has highlighted, not recently, but in the past, you have had Cornyn question the notion of a border wall. He in the past has taken maybe a softer stand on that issue. But on the other hand, I think like a lot of politicians, he adapts to the times. And so you've seen less out of him along those lines in the era of President Trump.
That's a great little capstone for the Texas Senate. So I'm sure we'll probably touch up on it with the next couple of slides. But for the audience wanting to advance past the Senate races, we just wanted to put a special emphasis on how the Senate races are the main card of the UFC fight. Okay, so I do have an additional just kind of background slide for the Dems. Some additional context, especially with the urban areas for the Democrats, because that's where we saw Beto O'Rourke's main voter turnout. I believe last time was the major urban and even suburban. We heard about this all the time back in 2018. How the battle for the suburbs was going to be the most important factor for the Democrats.
Absolutely. I think that at the same time, we're seeing some indications of strength from Crockett's candidacy. Again, a lot of the polling, including that University of Texas poll that you've seen both Aaron Wrights on the Republican side and then Talarico and others, I think, generally aligned with him, disputing on their side. You look at that and you look at, well, maybe you can bring out people from the suburbs, from areas around Houston, some of those suburbs that have elected Democrats in the past and that are in some cases still represented by that party. Maybe you can bring out people to really contest President Trump. But I still do wonder about the lasting, maybe demoralization that could come from Crockett losing. Maybe Crockett will ultimately be in a position to join with Talarico if he is the nominee. I would expect Talarico to avoid antagonizing Crockett if she is the nominee. But, Crockett also, it's worth noting that because of the redistricting, she kind of does not have a lot to lose. Because if she had not thrown her hat into the ring, she would have been contesting multiple Democrats in a new district. I believe Julia Johnston is her name. And this is the race that actually Colin Allred has jumped into, contesting that incumbent after this new map was laid out. So, Crockett, maybe there is a future for her in politics, maybe a future gubernatorial run, who knows? But really, there's not too many incentives for her to avoid being fairly aggressive and attempting to win here. And so I do wonder, could we be looking at, even as people are paying attention to this Republican fragmentation, maybe signs of a little less unity on the Democratic side with just how vicious that race has become, in addition to the Republican race.
And when you have the minority party in a state seeking to flip the seat or becoming a little more, if there's fragmentation and a divide in the primary, that only makes it that much harder. I remember I'm from Indiana originally, and in 2018, the Democrats, they had an incumbent with Joe. So this is a little different, but they had Joe Donnelly, the Democratic incumbent, and no one ran against him. They just let him kind of coast on to November. Didn't work out ultimately, but yeah, when you're the minority party, sometimes it helps to try and maybe make it a little more low key, just kind of protect, maybe coalesce around somebody and put all your eggs in one basket kind of deal.
Yeah, you need to be able to sing Kumbaya together. But we've seen signs. I'm just going to zoom out very briefly nationally of maybe some challenges with that for Democrats. John Fetterman has complained about more progressive elements in the party contesting him and some of his votes. He's occasionally voted with President Trump. He's occasionally, deviated to the right on issues, and that has stoked anger, dissatisfaction, maybe a primary challenge in the future. And then on the other hand, we have Jared Golden in the House, someone who is fairly unique from a district that has repeatedly voted for President Trump, but he is one of the last remaining Blue Dog Democrats. And he's someone who announced that he would not be running for re-election. So, those are factors, those are challenges that Democrats, even as minorities in both the House and the Senate, and with some elements of the midterms looking favorable to them, they have had challenges getting their own house in order in a way that I think for any party it's a problem, but if you're a minority, it's especially acute.